Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening, where the shadows draw long and the world outside fades into a gentle murmur. I am curious, where in this wide world are you listening tonight? Are you nestled beneath a heavy blanket, or perhaps resting by a quiet window as the day draws to a close? Wherever you find yourself, allow your mind to drift far across the years to the foggy, gaslit streets of late Victorian London, where the rhythmic clopping of horse hooves on wet cobblestones echoes softly through the mist. The steady patter of evening rain taps a soothing melody against the glass, inviting you to step out of the damp chill and into the warm embrace of Baker Street. Here, a cheerful fire crackles softly in the hearth, casting a golden glow that chases away the gloom, while the comforting scents of old paper, fragrant steeped tea, and the faint sweet notes of pipe tobacco linger in the cosy air. Within this sanctuary of peace, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson sit comfortably in their worn leather armchairs, contemplating a mystery as quiet and strange as the night itself. They speak in hushed, thoughtful tones of a secret space hidden deep within the labyrinth of the city, a forgotten room known only as the Shadowless Portrait Gallery. It is a place of impossible stillness, where the figures captured in the grand oil painting stand frozen under the illusion of brilliant light, yet mysteriously lack any trace of shadows upon their canvases. The evening had settled over London like a heavy velvet shroud drawn by a quiet and deliberate hand, weaving a tapestry of damp grey and charcoal across the sky. Rain wept against the tall glass windows of our Baker Street rooms with a soft and rhythmic persistence, a gentle drumming that seemed to count the seconds, slipping away into the darkening night. The hearth fire crackled with a comforting warmth, spitting tiny sparks of orange and gold that danced for a brief moment before surrendering to the soot-blackened bricks of the chimney. I sat in my deep leather armchair, allowing the familiar and soothing scents of the room to wrap around me like an old and cherished blanket. There was the rich, earthy aroma of Holmes's strong shag tobacco, lingering in the air like a ghostly presence, mingling beautifully with the delicate floral notes of the Darjeeling tea steaming gently in the fragile porcelain cup resting upon my knee. The world outside was a cold, wet labyrinth of slick cobblestones and deepening shadows, but within these walls there was only the steady ticking of the mantel clock and the rhythmic turning of pages as Holmes perused a heavy leather-bound volume of obscure alchemical history. His sharp profile was illuminated by the flickering gaslight, casting long, dramatic shadows across the cluttered walls, an irony of light and dark that would soon become entirely apparent to us both. It was the sound of the street below that first broke the profound tranquillity of our sanctuary. Through the muted patter of the relentless rain, the sharp, hollow clatter of hurried footsteps echoed against the wet cobblestones, a frantic and irregular cadence that spoke of desperation and a deep, unsettling fear. The footsteps paused directly beneath our window, followed by a heavy silence that stretched taut and thin until a hesitant, trembling knock sounded upon the heavy wooden door downstairs. I watched Holmes lower his heavy book with a glacial slowness, his grey eyes catching the glint of the firelight as he tilted his head, listening intently to the muffled exchange between our unseen visitor and the ever-patient Mrs. Hudson. Moments later, the slow, agonizing creak of the stairs announced the approach of our guest, a sound accompanied by the distinct wet drag of soaked garments clinging to exhausted limbs. When the door to our sitting room finally opened, it revealed a man who seemed to have carried the very essence of the winter storm inside with him. He was a slender, delicate-looking gentleman of perhaps 50 years, his thinning hair plastered to his forehead by the unforgiving rain, his expensive but worn wool overcoat dripping a steady rhythmic puddle onto the threadbare carpet. He stood in the doorway, trembling like a brittle leaf caught in an autumn gale, his pale, wide eyes darting nervously around the room until they finally settled upon Holmes. The very air in the room shifted as he entered, bringing with it the sharp, unmistakable odours of damp wool, cold rain, and something else, something subtle and ancient, like the scent of dried varnish, decaying canvas, and the undisturbed dust of forgotten and windowless rooms. Holmes set his book aside with a deliberate grace, his long, pale fingers gesturing softly toward the empty chair nearest the blazing fire. He offered no immediate greeting, no sudden questions to startle the fragile creature before us. allowing the quiet warmth of the room to perform its gentle work upon the shivering man. I rose from my seat, placing my teacup upon the small wooden table, and quietly poured a fresh measure of the steaming amber liquid into a clean porcelain cup, offering it to the stranger without uttering a single word. The man took it with violently trembling hands, the fine china rattling sharply against the saucer as he brought it to his pale lips. He drank deeply, closing his eyes as the heat of the tea spread through his chilled frame, and when he opened them again, some of the frantic animal terror had receded, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion that seemed to age him another 10 years. He introduced himself in a reedy, breathless whisper as Elias Thorne, the sole curator and guardian of the St. Jude Gallery, a small and little-known repository of early 19th century portraiture tucked away in a narrow, forgotten alley near the labyrinthine heart of the city. His voice barely carried over the sound of the crackling fire and the rain tapping against the glass, forcing both Holmes and myself to lean forward to catch his fragile words. He spoke of the gallery with a reverence that bordered on the tragic, describing the quiet, dusty halls lined with the painted faces of lords and ladies long consigned to the earth, faces he had meticulously tended, dusted and preserved for more than 2 decades in utter solitude. But it was not the creeping damp or the isolation that had driven him out into the tempestuous night, he explained, his voice catching painfully in his throat, while his knuckles whitening as he gripped the fragile teacup as if it were a lifeline. It was the paintings themselves. He looked at Holmes with a desperation that was palpable, a silent pleading in his eyes that begged for understanding rather than the ridicule he clearly expected. "The shadows," he whispered. "The shadows painted upon the canvases, the masterful strokes of umber and black that gave depth to a cheekbone, or mystery to a heavy fold of velvet, were vanishing into thin air." I confess I looked at the man with a measure of profound pity, assuming the crushing isolation and the damp, toxic fumes of the old gallery had somehow slowly deteriorated his mind. Yet Holmes merely leaned further forward, resting his sharp chin upon his steepled fingers, his eyes completely devoid of the medical skepticism I felt certain was radiating from my own rigid posture. He asked Mr. Thorne to explain, in the most exacting and chronological detail, the progression of this seemingly impossible phenomenon. The curator obliged, his words tumbling out now with a frantic, unburdening energy. It had begun 3 days prior, in the portrait of a minor duke situated in the eastern wing of the long, sombre hall. Thorne had been performing his meticulous morning dusting, a routine unchanged for 20 years, when he noticed a peculiar, unsettling flatness to the duke's arrogant visage. Upon closer inspection, he realised that the heavy shadow cast by the duke's prominent nose, a shadow that had been a defining feature of the original artist's technique, was entirely absent. The paint beneath where the shadow should have been was undisturbed, pristine and solid, yet the darkness was entirely gone, leaving the face looking strangely swollen, brightly lit, and deeply surreal. He had dismissed it initially as a trick of the morning light, a momentary lapse in his own aging perception, or perhaps a sudden failure of his memory regarding that specific piece. But the following day, the malady had spread like a quiet contagion. 3 more portraits in the adjacent dimly lit corridor had been similarly stripped of their painted darkness, the delicate shadows nestled in the deep folds of a silk gown, the deliberate moody shading behind a stern aristocratic brow, the deep mysterious gloom lurking in the painted backgrounds of the canvases, all had evaporated like morning mist under a burning sun, leaving the subject suspended in a flat, harsh and unforgiving 2-dimensional space. And today, just hours before he had fled his post and run to our door, the affliction had reached the grand centrepiece of the gallery, the massive towering family portrait of the Earl of Blackwood, a painting historically renowned for its masterly and dramatic use of chiaroscuro. Now, the Earl and his family stood brightly and unnaturally illuminated, their faces devoid of the depth that life and shadow bestow, staring out from the canvas with an eerie, vacant flatness that had chilled Mr. Thorne to his very marrow and sent him running into the freezing rain. The room descended into a heavy, contemplative silence as the curator finally finished his tale, his chest heaving as if he had just run a great distance. The only sounds remaining in the room, the slow, methodical ticking of the clock and the steady, weeping rhythm of the rain outside. I waited for Holmes to gently and kindly dismiss the man, to suggest a reliable physician or a long rest by the sea air. But my friend remained perfectly still, his penetrating eyes focused entirely on the dancing, shifting flames of the hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant hum, gentle and quiet, yet vibrating with an undeniable current of intense intellectual arousal. He noted that while art forgery, the chemical degradation of unstable pigments, and the natural fading of oils over time were well documented and thoroughly understood phenomena, the selective, targeted vanishing of painted shadows without the accompanying destruction of the surrounding coloured oils presented a most unique, poetic, and utterly impossible puzzle. He stood up slowly, unfolding his tall, angular frame with the deliberate, languid grace of a waking cat, and reached for his heavy tweed cape and his deerstalker hat resting upon the wooden peg by the door. He turned to me, a subtle, unmistakable glint of anticipation dancing in the grey depths of his eyes, and murmured that the night was yet young, and that a gallery entirely devoid of shadows seemed a rather fitting place to seek a little illumination. I could never refuse that quiet, magnetic invitation, and so I too rose and donned my heavy winter coat, wrapping a thick woolen scarf tightly around my neck to ward off the encroaching damp chill of the storm. Mr. Thorne watched our preparations with a chaotic mixture of profound relief and lingering, deeply rooted terror, his empty teacup still rattling slightly in his lap until I gently took it from his rigid grasp and set it back upon the table. We moved down the dimly lit, creaking staircase of Baker Street in a solemn, silent procession, leaving the warm, fragrant sanctuary of our sitting room for the cold, unyielding reality of the London night. The journey to the St. Jude Gallery was undertaken in a hansom cab that smelled faintly of wet leather, damp wool and old, decaying straw, rattling its way through the labyrinthine streets of a city that felt entirely drowned in mist and rain. I sat closely beside Holmes, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic clopping of the horse's iron-shod hooves against the slick, uneven cobblestones, a sound that seemed to measure the growing distance between the comfortable world of logic and reason we'd just left behind and the realm of the bizarre into which we were now plunging headlong. The tall gas lamps lining the desolate streets bled pale, sickly yellow halos into the thick, swirling fog, their struggling light illuminating brief, ghostly vignettes of hunched pedestrians, hurrying desperately for the shelter of deep doorways. Water streamed continuously down the thick glass window of the cab, distorting the passing brick buildings into wavering, fluid, and unnatural shapes that I imagined resembled the very shadowless portraits our distraught companion had just described. Mr. Thorne sat directly opposite us, huddled deep into the corner of the carriage, his eyes squeezed tightly shut and his hands clasped together as if attempting to block out the very memory of the gallery, or perhaps the mounting fear of returning to its quiet halls. Holmes remained completely silent for the entire duration of the journey, his sharp silhouette a motionless shadow against the faintly illuminated window, his brilliant mind no doubt constructing, testing, and discarding a dozen different theories with the speed and flawless precision of a master clockmaker. I found myself slowly lulled into a state of quiet, drifting melancholy, the gentle swaying motion of the carriage, and the relentless whispering patter of the rain conspiring to draw my thoughts down into a deep, introspective calm, leaving me wondering what strange chemistry of man, time, or nature could entirely strip a painting of its soul. The cab finally drew to a halt with a sudden jarring jolt, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding harshly against the stone curb of a narrow, forgotten, and thoroughly miserable alleyway. We stepped out into the freezing, misty drizzle, the damp cold immediately seeping through the heavy wool of our coats and settling deep into our bones. The alley was utterly devoid of light, save for a single flickering and struggling gas lamp at the far end that cast long, wavering and sickly shadows across the slick, rain-washed cobblestones. Mr. Thorne produced a heavy, rusted iron ring of keys from the depths of his damp coat pockets, his hands shaking so violently that the metal clattered and chimed like a collection of desperate bells in the quiet, suffocating night. He approached a pair of massive, imposing wooden doors set deep into a crumbling stone archway, their ancient surface black and slick with the rain, looking far more like the sealed entrance to an ancient mausoleum than a public gallery of fine art. It took him 3 frantic attempts to fit the large, heavy iron key into the ancient lock, the internal mechanism finally turning with a loud, complaining groan that echoed sharply off the close brick walls of the narrow passage. He pushed the heavy, resisting doors open, revealing a wall of absolute impenetrable darkness that seemed to spill out into the wet alley like a physical, suffocating substance. Holmes reached into the deep pocket of his cape and withdrew a silver matchbox, striking a match with a sharp, explosive hiss that momentarily blinded us with its brilliant, flaring white light. He held the small, eyes trembling flame high aloft, stepping confidently across the threshold into the cavernous space beyond, allowing the trapped scent of the gallery to wash over us instantly. It was a thick, complex and deeply historical odour, a heavy mixture of dry, decaying canvas, pungent linseed oil, ancient, undisturbed dust, and the faint, sickly sweet smell of beeswax that had been used to polish the wooden floors over countless silent decades. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the oppressive gloom, I could begin to perceive the vast, echoing dimensions of the grand hall. It was a long, incredibly high-ceilinged gallery, the walls lined with heavy, ornate frames of carved and gilded wood that glinted faintly and teasingly in the meagre, dying light of Holmes's match. Mr. Thorne hurried with practiced steps to a small, delicate wooden table near the entrance, his trembling hands locating a heavy brass candelabra holding 3 thick, unlit wax candles. He lit them rapidly from Holmes's match, just a moment before the flame burned down to the investigator's bare fingertips, the 3 tiny new flames casting a warm, golden, flickering glow that managed to push the darkness back just a few meagre feet in every direction. The shadows we cast upon the dusty, uneven wooden floor were incredibly long and beautifully distorted, stretching out like dark, reaching fingers into the unseen, silent corners of the vast room. It was then, as the golden candlelight slowly played across the surface of the first painting on the nearest wall, that I truly and deeply understood the absolute depth of the curator's terror. Yet it was a half-length portrait of an elderly gentleman in a sombre, dark coat, painted with an obviously high degree of technical skill and traditional patience. But the face, suddenly lit by the flickering, dancing light of our candles, was deeply, profoundly, and terrifyingly wrong. The eyes were flat and unblinking, utterly devoid of the subtle, masterful shading that should have given them depth, sorrow, and the illusion of life. The heavy, layered folds of the man's white cravat, which should have harboured deep, rich pools of black and umber within their recesses, were simply a uniform, glaring and blindingly flat expanse of white paint. The painted figure seemed to be pressing unnaturally outward against the canvas, unmoored from the dark painted background, floating in a harsh, terrifying 2-dimensional void that rejected the very rules of optics. There was no shadow beneath his chin, no comforting darkness in the hollows of his cheeks, no gradient of light to define the bridge of his nose. It was as if the very concept of absence, the physical, earthly manifestation of shade, had been violently erased from the artist's vocabulary, leaving behind a brightly coloured, monstrously flat ghost. The silence in the gallery was absolute, a heavy, suffocating and unnatural stillness that seemed to absorb the quiet sounds of our breathing and the faint rustle of our damp clothing. I could hear the faint, metallic and wet ticking of my own pocket watch, a sound that felt entirely out of place and irreverent in this timeless, deeply altered space. Holmes stepped closer to the ruined canvas, bringing the heavy brass candelabra with him, allowing the golden light to wash fully over the flat, unnatural face of the painted gentleman. He withdrew a silver magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket, leaning in so incredibly close that his prominent nose nearly brushed the dry surface of the painting. He moved the glass in slow, deliberate and overlapping circles, his sharp eyes tracing the invisible microscopic brushstrokes, searching diligently for the minute evidence of chemical tampering, excessive cleaning, or physical alteration of the delicate pigment. I watched him in the quiet, dusty gloom, noticing how the candlelight caught the sharp, aristocratic angles of his own face, beautifully accentuating the deep, natural shadows around his eyes and beneath his cheekbones, providing a stark, vital, and deeply comforting contrast to the chilling flatness of the portrait he studied so intently. He stood there for a long, immeasurable time, the comforting smell of the burning candle wax mixing with the dry, ancient dust of the room, creating an atmosphere that felt both deeply sacred and profoundly disturbing. He moved the candle slightly to the left, allowing the light to graze the surface of the canvas from a very sharp, oblique angle, revealing the raised, physical texture of the dried oil paint. I could clearly see the thick, deliberate ridges where the artist had laid down the pigment with a heavy brush, proving the physical topography of the portrait remained entirely intact and undamaged. And yet, the darkness that should have resided within those painted ridges, the carefully mixed shadows that gave the grand illusion of form and reality, were simply gone, leaving the topography painted in bright, unchanging hues. Without uttering a single word breaking the quiet spell of his observation, Holmes turned away from the first painting and began a slow, measured and silent walk down the length of the long gallery, the candelabra held steadily in his outstretched hand like a beacon in a fog. Mr. Thorne and I followed closely behind, our cautious footsteps muffled by a long, threadbare and deeply faded runner rug that stretched down the exact centre of the creaking wooden floor. With every deliberate step we took, the golden light of the candles revealed yet another silent casualty of this impossible spreading affliction. We passed a large, sweeping portrait of a young woman in a pale blue silk dress, her face rendered so flat and completely shadowless that she resembled a cheap, brightly painted porcelain doll staring blankly and foolishly into the void. We passed a hunting scene featuring a large hound, its powerful, muscular form reduced to a bright, confusing and dizzying amalgamation of brown and white shapes, entirely lacking in physical depth or volume. The gallery felt less like a carefully curated repository of historical art and far more like a quiet morgue for souls that had been stripped of their earthly weight, trapped forever in a brightly lit, inescapable purgatory of flat, unforgiving pigment. The deeper we ventured into the dusty, echoing hall, the heavier and colder the air seemed to become, thick with the scent of old varnish and the overwhelming, crushing sense of a mystery that defied the very established laws of physics and human reason. The rain continued to beat heavily and mournfully against the high, vaulted glass skylights far above our heads, a distant, muffled drumming that only served to amplify the profound, unsettling quiet of the shadowless room below. We finally arrived at the very centre of the gallery, a wide, circular rotunda space where the walls curved outward, gracefully to accommodate a massive, imposing canvas that stretched nearly from the wooden floorboards to the high, shadowed ceiling. This, I knew from the curator's whispered and terrified tale, was the grand portrait of the Earl of Blackwood and his family, the crown jewel of the St. Jude collection. Holmes lifted the candelabra higher into the air, the three small, these struggling flames fighting to illuminate the sheer scale and magnitude of the painting before us. It was a masterwork of complex composition, featuring the Earl seated in a heavy carved velvet chair, surrounded by his standing wife and three small children, a dark, turbulent and stormy landscape visible through a painted stone window behind them. But the majestic, sweeping power of the piece had been utterly and completely annihilated. The carefully constructed chiaroscuro, the dramatic, emotional interplay of light and dark that had been the absolute hallmark of the unknown artist's genius, had vanished without leaving a single trace of its existence. The painted velvet of the Earl's chair, once a rich, mysterious and deeply inviting black, was now a flat, glaring and painful expanse of unshaded crimson. The stormy, threatening sky behind the family possessed absolutely no atmospheric depth, appearing instead like a bright painted wall pressing uncomfortably and claustrophobically close against the back of the family's heads. The faces of the children, entirely lacking the soft, rounded and gentle shadows of youth, looked bloated, sickly and surreal, their painted eyes wide and staring, locked in a flat, terrifying brightness that offered no comfort or humanity. Holmes stepped right up to the very edge of the massive, intricately carved gilded frame, his grey eyes sweeping rapidly across the vast expanse of shadowless canvas with a fierce, burning and almost predatory intensity. He knelt down slowly upon the dusty floorboard, bringing the candle dangerously close to the bottom edge of the painting, right to the corner where the artist's signature should have proudly resided in a pool of dark, painted shadow. He remained there, a silent, solitary and deeply focused figure bathed in a small pool of golden light, completely surrounded by the towering flat faces of the long dead, waiting patiently for the canvas to yield its impossible, silent secrets to the quiet, penetrating power of his mind. I stood a few paces behind him, pulling my heavy woolen coat tighter around my shoulders as a deep, unnatural and biting chill seemed to radiate directly from the very walls of the circular room. Mr. Thorne hovered nervously near the edge of the candlelight, His thin hands clasped so tightly together his knuckles were bone white. His shallow, rapid and terrified breathing, the only sound breaking the immense suffocating silence of the hall. I allowed my gaze to wander away from the horrific flatness of the massive family portrait, letting my eyes trace the ornate carved plaster mouldings that bordered the high ceiling, details that were nearly lost in the oppressive gloom that our meagre candles could simply not reach. The architecture of the gallery spoke of a bygone era of quiet refinement, of immense wealth poured into silent, artistic contemplation, yet now the entire building felt like a magnificent sinking tomb slowly descending into an endless heavy sea of despair. The smell of the ancient beeswax polish grew much stronger in this enclosed central rotunda, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of the cold dampness seeping slowly through the old brick walls. I looked back to the Blackwood portrait, forcing myself to truly and deeply observe the unnatural state of the canvas despite the discomfort it caused me. It was deeply and physically disorienting, causing a subtle, sickening vertigo to bloom slowly behind my eyes. The human mind is so profoundly accustomed to the continuous presence of shadow, relying entirely upon the visual cues of depth and volume to understand the world, that its total, unexplained absence creates a profound and deeply unsettling cognitive dissonance. The brightly painted figures in the family portrait seemed almost to vibrate against each other, their bright, unshaded colours clashing fiercely and violently against one another without the mediating, calming grace of darkness. It was a brutal, unforgiving and scientific illumination, exposing every single brushstroke, every tiny, human imperfection in the weave of the raw canvas, stripping away all the poetry and mystery, leaving behind only a harsh, naked and deeply uncomfortable reality. Holmes rose slowly from his kneeling position, the joints of his long legs popping quietly but distinctly in the still dead air of the rotunda. He moved with extreme care to the right side of the massive frame, holding the silver magnifying glass so close to the canvas that the metal rim of the glass occasionally tapped gently against the dried oil paint with a sound like a tiny muffled and distant bell. He was meticulously tracing the very edge of the Earl's painted wool coat, following the exact razor-sharp line where the heavy garment met the flat, unshaded background of the painted room. I watched the rapid, searching movement of his eyes, darting back and forth, absorbing microscopic chemical details that were entirely invisible to my own aging sight. He paused his sweeping motions, slowly lowering the magnifying glass and the candelabra, plunging the right side of the massive painting back into the thick, dusty and welcome gloom. He turned his head slowly away from the canvas, his sharp profile beautifully silhouetted against the remaining candlelight, and closed his eyes in a moment of deep, total concentration. I knew this familiar posture intimately. It was the physical manifestation of a brilliant mind retreating deep into its own vast, perfectly organised internal library, searching frantically but methodically through countless volumes of esoteric knowledge, obscure chemical reactions, botanical oddities, and the infinite dark annals of human deception. He stood there in perfect, easy, unbreathing stillness for several long minutes, appearing as a living, thinking statue amidst a gallery of flat, lifeless ghosts, while the rain continued its mournful, relentless tapping against the glass skylights far above our heads. When he finally opened his eyes, there was a brilliant new sharpness to them, a glittering, dangerous edge of focused curiosity that had entirely banished the quiet, comfortable melancholy of our earlier evening by the fire. He motioned with a slight wave of his hand for Mr. Thorne to approach, his voice, when he finally chose to speak, echoing softly and musically through the cavernous rotunda, sounding smooth and deeply resonant against the harshness of the unshadowed art. He asked the trembling, weeping curator to describe the precise and exact lighting conditions of the gallery during the daytime, inquiring specifically and intensely about the exact angle of the sun through the high windows, the temperature of the room during the summer months, and the exact chemical nature of the gas fixtures used when the natural light finally failed the space. Mr. Thorne swallowed hard, the nervous sound echoing loudly in the quiet room, and began to explain the gallery's historical lighting arrangements in a voice that was barely more than a ragged, weeping whisper. He detailed the heavy, treated canvas blinds that were systematically drawn over the skylights during the brightest, most damaging hours of the summer to protect the delicate, ancient pigments from fading, and the specific, rigid schedule for lighting the brass wall sconces as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the wooden floor. As he spoke, Holmes moved slowly and deliberately around the perimeter of the circular room, examining the heavy, ornate brass sconces affixed to the curving walls, running his long, sensitive fingers over the cold, tarnished metal and the thick, protective glass globes. He paused for a long time at one particular sconce situated directly opposite the massive Blackwood portrait, leaning in incredibly close to inspect the soot-blackened interior of the glass. He reached into his deep coat pocket and produced a pristine, perfectly folded white linen handkerchief, using it to gently and carefully wipe a thin, nearly invisible layer of fine, dark, oily powder from the inside of the glass globe. He brought the stained, delicate linen to his nose, his eyes closing halfway as he inhaled the complex scent of the mysterious hidden residue. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the very corners of his lips, a fleeting, private expression of profound satisfaction that told me immediately that the game, however bizarre, deeply terrifying, and seemingly impossible, was now officially and entirely afoot. He folded the handkerchief meticulously, trapping the dark powder within the pristine folds, tucking it safely back into the depths of his heavy coat, and turned slowly to face the vast, flat, shadowless painting that dominated the silent room. He whispered softly, his voice floating like thin grey smoke on the cold, damp air of the gallery, that the complete absence of a thing very often leaves a far more profound, interesting, and revealing mark upon the world than its continued presence, and that in order to finally find the missing shadows that had fled this terrified canvas, we must first deeply understand the true hidden nature of the specific light that had so violently driven them away. The hour had grown exceedingly late, and the world beyond the curtained windows of Baker Street had surrendered entirely to the damp, heavy cloak of a London fog, leaving our sitting room as a solitary island of warmth amidst a sea of drifting grey. The fire in the grate had burned down to a fragile architecture of glowing orange embers, occasionally collapsing upon itself with a soft, breathy sigh that sent a momentary flurry of sparks up the darkened chimney, while the steady, rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock seemed only to deepen the profound quiet that had settled over us. I sat in my usual armchair, a forgotten book resting open upon my knee, lulled into a state of pleasant lethargy by the familiar, comforting scents of old paper, worn leather, and the lingering, faintly sweet aroma of the shag tobacco that my companion had been smoking earlier in the evening. Across the room, bathed in the solitary golden pool of light cast by a single gas lamp, turned down to a mere sliver of illumination, Sherlock Holmes was hunched over his makeshift chemical laboratory, a silhouette of sharp angles and intense, motionless concentration. The brass fittings of his microscope gleamed warmly in the shadows, catching the faint light as he made infinitesimal adjustments with his long, sensitive fingers, his breath slow and measured, as if he feared the slightest current of air might disturb the delicate work unfolding beneath his lens. There was a profound peace in this shared silence, a testament to the years we'd spent in each other's company, yet where words were often rendered unnecessary by the simple, grounding presence of a friend in the quiet hours of the night. He was examining a tiny scraping, a mere flake of material no larger than a teardrop, which he had so carefully extracted from the edge of the mysterious canvas we had brought back from the gallery in the fading hours of the afternoon. The air around his workbench carried a faint, almost metallic tang, a whisper of obscure chemicals and forgotten dust that mingled strangely with the homely scent of my cooling tea, creating an atmosphere that was at once domestic and distinctly arcane. For a long while, the only sounds in the room were the soft, erratic tapping of rain beginning to fall against the glass panes, sounding like the gentle rapping of ghostly fingers seeking entry from the cold, and the occasional, almost musical clink of a glass vial as Holmes transferred a single drop of some translucent solvent onto the glass slide. I watched the smoke from the dying fire curl lazily upward, losing itself in the shadows of the ceiling, and allowed my mind to drift back to the strange, unsettling portrait that now stood covered by a heavy velvet cloth in the corner of our room, a painting that seemed to defy the very laws of nature by casting absolutely no shadow against the wall behind it. It was a visual impossibility that had deeply disturbed the gallery owner, a poor man whose nerves were entirely shattered by the unnatural presence of the artwork, and it was a quiet, haunting puzzle that had immediately captured the restless, brilliant mind of my friend. Presently, Holmes leaned back from the eyepiece of the microscope, his silhouette merging with the deeper shadows of the room, and he let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a weary sigh carried on a gentle evening breeze. He remained perfectly still for a moment, his hands resting lightly upon the edge of the wooden table before he turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes catching a faint glimmer from the dying hearth. "Watson, my dear fellow," he murmured, his voice incredibly soft, a low resonant baritone that barely disturbed the quiet air, a whisper meant only for the shadows and the trusted confidence of an old friend. "I wonder if you might do me the kindness of extinguishing the gas lamp completely, for the secret of our shadowless portrait requires a canvas of absolute darkness in order to reveal its true, melancholic nature." I rose slowly from my chair, the leather creaking with a muted, uncomfortable sound, and crossed the room with measured steps, the floorboards groaning faintly beneath the thick Persian rug, until I stood beside his workbench, where the singular, hissing flame of the lamp fought a losing battle against the encroaching night. With a gentle turn of the brass key, I choked off the flow of gas, and the room was instantly plunged into a profound, velvety blackness, save for the weak, dying glow of the firelight struggling to reach us from across the long room. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the sudden deprivation of light, a strange and ethereal phenomenon began to unfold upon the dark wooden surface of Holmes's work table, a sight so quietly wondrous and deeply unsettling that it caused the breath to catch softly in my throat. The tiny flake of paint, which had appeared merely as a dull, this unremarkable crust of white pigment beneath the glaring light of the gas lamp, was now emanating a faint, sickly luminescence, a ghostly, pale green glow that seemed to float free from the glass slide. It was not a sharp or piercing light, but rather a soft, breathing radiance, like the bioluminescence of strange deep-sea creatures, or the eerie, spectral glow of foxfire in a damp, decaying forest, and it cast a faint, almost imperceptible halo upon the polished wood and the gleaming brass base of the microscope. I watched, mesmerized by the silent, glowing phantom, as Holmes slowly reached out and moved the glass slide with the tip of his finger, the pale green light tracking smoothly across the darkness, leaving a momentary ghostly afterimage in my vision. "This, Watson, is the heart of the mystery," Holmes whispered, his voice floating to me through the dark, carrying a note of deep, almost sorrowful reverence. "It is not a trick of optics, nor a clever manipulation of mirrors and angles within the gallery, but a physical property born of earth and sorrow, a pigment that drinks the light of the day only to bleed it back into the darkness, banishing shadows by creating its own terrible, unnatural illumination." He struck a match, the sudden, brilliant flare of sulphur momentarily blinding, and the warm golden light washed away the spectral green glow, returning the room to the realm of the ordinary, as he set the flame to the bowl of his briar pipe. The sweet, rich scent of the tobacco smoke billowed upward, curling around his sharp features as he drew deeply. Sex, the red glow of the pipe bowl pulsing like a heartbeat in the dimness, before he gently waved the match out, letting the room settle once more into a comfortable, dusky twilight. "The canvas," he continued, his tone rhythmic and slow like the gentle rocking of a boat on calm waters, was primed and painted using a most extraordinary and tragic concoction, a rare variant of a phosphorescent compound related to the ancient sunstone of the alchemists, but mixed with a far more potent and destructive element. The artist did not merely mix oil and earth to capture the likeness of his subject. He ground down a luminous, radioactive mineral, a stone brought back from the deepest, most shadowed crevices of a forgotten cavern, seeking to capture the literal essence of light, and to trap a soul upon the canvas so that it might shine eternally through the gloom of mortality. But in his desperate pursuit of capturing this immortal radiance, he invited a silent, creeping poison into his studio. A toxic dust that settled upon his skin, filled his lungs, and slowly, irrevocably, consumed the very life he was so desperately trying to preserve in paint. I settled back into the shadows near his workbench, leaning against the cool, smooth wood of a bookshelf, listening to the steady, comforting sound of the rain against the window as Holmes wove the tragic history of the canvas into the quiet air. "The stone itself," Holmes whispered, his eyes distant, "was a freak of geological nature. born in the deepest, lightless veins of a coastal cavern where the crushing weight of the earth met the relentless, or freezing pressure of the sea. Over millennia, rare alkaline earths mingled with decaying organic matter from the deep ocean trench, crystallizing in complete darkness to form a mineral that desperately hungered for light. When finally struck by the sun, or even the pale rays of the moon, the crystalline structure absorbed the energy like a sponge soaking up water, trapping the light within its lattice. But the mineral was deeply unstable, a fragile prison for the illumination it consumed, and as it slowly decayed, it wept that light back into the world, accompanied by a silent, invisible emanation that brought ruin to living flesh. The old sailor who found it, wandering half-mad in a dinghy after his ship was splintered upon the rocks, thought he had discovered a trove of fallen stars carrying the heavy and glowing rocks back to the mainland wrapped in tarpaulin. He traded them for a handful of coins and a warm bed, never knowing that he was handing a desperate artist the very instrument of his own tragic demise. "The painter," Holmes murmured, the smoke from his pipe drifting like a pale ghost across the dying light of the fire, was a man named Elias Thorne, a solitary soul who lived in a crumbling, sea-battered cottage on the jagged, windswept cliffs of Cornwall, where the roar of the ocean was a constant, mournful companion. He was a man deeply, overwhelmingly consumed by a love so profound and desperate that it fractured his reason, for his young wife, a woman of reportedly ethereal beauty, was slowly fading from the world, her life draining away like the receding tide, taken by a wasting illness that no physician could halt. Thorne, either maddened by grief and the terrible impending silence of his home, became obsessed with the idea of painting her portrait before the end, but he was driven by a frantic, unnatural desire to create a likeness that would not merely reflect the light, but would generate its own, ensuring she would never truly fade into the dark. It was during a frantic search for the purest, brightest pigments that he encountered the old broken sailor, eagerly purchasing the heavy leaden box containing the pale, crystalline powder, believing with all his shattered heart that he had found a holy light trapped in stone, a miracle brought from the edges of the earth to save the memory of his beloved from the encroaching shadows of the grave. Holmes paused, the silence in the room stretching out, then filled only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the soft hiss of the settling coals, allowing the melancholic weight of the story to settle over us like a heavy velvet blanket. Thorne spent weeks grinding the luminous crystals in his mortar, his studio filled with a fine, glittering dust that settled over his brushes, his clothes, and the pale, trembling hands of his dying wife as she sat for him in the fading autumn light. He mixed the powder with poppy seed oil and a heavy lead-white primer, creating a thick, luminous paste that glowed with a sickly, beautiful radiance even in the twilight, applying it to the canvas with a frantic, obsessive energy, layering the glowing pigment to form the delicate curves of her face, the folds of her dress, the hollows of her eyes. He did not realize, as he painted with tears blurring his vision, that the miraculous glow was born of a deadly radioactive decay, a silent, invisible fire that was poisoning the air they breathed, accelerating her tragic decline while simultaneously destroying his own mind and body. The portrait became a glowing mirror of her death, capturing her fading essence while the toxic aura of the paint ensured that neither of them would survive to see the winter snows fall upon the dark cliffs of the Cornish coast. The scent of the rain seemed to seep through the window frames, bringing with it the cold, earthy smell of the wet London streets, a stark contrast to the tragic, isolated cliffside that Holmes was so vividly painting with his whispered words. When the villagers finally came to the cottage, disturbed by the unnatural, seeing continuous pale green light that leaked from the shuttered windows night after night, they found a scene of profound and heartbreaking devastation, a silent tomb illuminated only by the terrible beauty of the artwork. Thorne was found slumped before the easel, his hands stained with the glowing white paste, his breath stilled forever, while his wife lay at peace upon her chaise longue, both of them bathed in the soft, shadowless radiance that emanated from the canvas, a light that cast no dark outlines because it radiated equally from every painted brushstroke. The villagers, terrified by the glowing apparition and the sudden, unexplainable deaths, sealed the cottage and sold the painting to a travelling merchant, eager to be rid of the cursed object, sending the canvas on a long, wandering journey through the shadowed corners of Europe before it finally arrived in the quiet gallery of our current client. They did not understand the chemistry of the tragedy, only the folklore of a cursed painting that consumed the souls of its creator and its subject, leaving behind a portrait that refused to cast a shadow, a painting that stood as a luminous, unnatural monument to a love that was quite literally toxic. I watched the glowing ember of Holmes's pipe as he moved slightly in the darkness, the faint red light briefly illuminating the sharp aquiline curve of his nose and the deep, thoughtful furrows upon his brow. Our gallery owner, the poor, trembling man who came to our door this morning, Holmes continued, his voice softer still, a mere breath against the silence. He was entirely unaware of the deadly history woven into the very fabric of the canvas he had so proudly displayed in his shadowed alcove. He noticed only the unsettling visual effect, the way the painting seemed to devour the shadows around it, the way it glowed faintly long after the gallery lamps were extinguished, a phenomenon that unnerved his patrons and chilled his own blood as he walked the quiet halls of his establishment at night. The paint absorbs the ambient light throughout the day, storing the energy within the unstable structure of the luminous mineral, and then slowly releases it as a continuous, omnidirectional glow, effectively illuminating the wall behind it and washing away any shadow that the heavy wooden frame might cast. It is a brilliant, entirely unintentional optical illusion, born of a desperate artist's grief. But it is also an ongoing hazard, for the pigment continues to emit a slow, invisible radiation, a lingering breath of the tragedy that claimed Elias Thorne and his beloved wife so many years ago. The fire in the grate finally collapsed with a soft, final sigh, the last structure of glowing coals breaking apart into a bed of dull grey ash, leaving the room almost entirely dependent upon the faint, distant light of the street lamps filtering through the damp fog outside. I felt a profound sense of melancholy settle over my heart, a heavy, quiet sadness for the doomed painter and the glowing, shadowless monument he had left behind, a beautiful, cursed thing that had brought only terror and confusion to those who encountered it. "What then shall we do with it, Holmes?" I asked softly, my voice sounding strangely loud in the hushed, deeply shadowed room, a reluctant intrusion upon the sacred, sorrowful quiet that my friend had conjured. "We cannot simply return it to the gallery, knowing the invisible poison it breathes into the air, nor can we destroy a work of such profound, if tragic artistic devotion, a piece of history painted with the very dust of a broken heart." Holmes remained silent for a long moment, the only movement the slow, deliberate rise and fall of his chest, as he took one final draw from his pipe, the sweet smoke lingering heavy and fragrant in the cool, damp air of the sitting room. "We shall have it carefully removed, Watson," he replied, his tone gentle and decisive, a comforting anchor in the drifting sea of the evening's revelations. "I know of a curator at the British Museum, a man who specialises in hazardous historical artefacts, or who will know how to seal the canvas beneath a thick layer of protective leaded glass, preserving the tragic beauty of the artwork while safely containing the dangerous, glowing breath of the luminous pigment. It shall be placed in a quiet, shadowed archive far from the public eye, where it can glow softly in the dark, a silent, eternal memorial to Elias Thorne and his wife, resting at last in the peaceful obscurity they were so tragically denied in life. And with that, my dear friend, I believe this strange, melancholic puzzle is finally concluded, and we might allow ourselves the comfort of a few hours of dreamless sleep before the dawn breaks over the wet, grey slates of London." He struck another match, the sudden light washing away the haunting darkness of the room, and moved to relight the gas lamp, the warm, golden glow slowly expanding to fill the corners, chasing away the spectral memories of the glowing canvas and the doomed seaside cottage. The familiar, comforting shapes of our sitting room returned to us, the disorganised shelves of books, the cluttered desk, the worn velvet of the armchairs, grounding us once more in the present moment, away from the haunting, shadowless world of the cursed portrait. As I rose to bank the ashes in the fireplace, listening to the steady, peaceful drumming of the rain against the glass, I felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the warm light, the familiar sense of our home, and the steadfast, brilliant presence of the man who could so gently unravel the darkest, most sorrowful mysteries of the human heart, leaving behind a profound and lingering peace. The night stretched on, quiet and undisturbed, the only shadows remaining being the natural comforting ones cast by the steady golden light of the lamp, a testament to the fact that even the most unnatural glowing darkness could be softly laid to rest by the careful, whispered deductions of Sherlock Holmes. The rain continued its gentle serenade against the window panes, a soothing, repetitive rhythm that washed over the quiet street below, masking the occasional distant clatter of a late-night hansom cab navigating the slick cobblestones. I poured myself a small measure of brandy from the crystal decanter upon the sideboard, the amber liquid catching the lamplight with a warm, inviting gleam, and settled back into my armchair, letting the deep, resonant silence of the room envelop me entirely. Holmes had returned to his workbench, his movements slow and deliberate as he meticulously cleaned the glass slide, carefully wiping away the tiny tragic flake of luminous pigment with a cloth dampened in solvent, ensuring that no trace of the deadly dust remained to haunt our sanctuary. The acrid scent of the chemical mingled momentarily with the lingering aroma of the tobacco smoke, a brief, sharp reminder of the investigation, before fading away into the familiar comforting bouquet of old books and worn wood that defined our shared existence at Baker Street. I watched him as he placed the clean slide back into its wooden case, the soft click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere, a final, definitive punctuation to the evening's melancholy labour. He stood quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed upon the heavy velvet cloth draped over the easel in the corner of the room, beneath which the tragic shadowless canvas rested, its unnatural glow safely hidden away from our tired eyes. "There is a profound poetry in it, Watson," he said softly, without turning around, his voice a gentle murmur that seemed to float upon the still air, a musing intended as much for himself as it was for me. A man seeks to banish the darkness of death, with a light drawn from the very earth, only to find that the light itself is a silent, consuming fire, a radiant poison that seals the very doom he sought so desperately to evade. It is a reminder, perhaps, that some shadows are necessary, that the dark outlines which define our existence are not merely the absence of light, but the protective boundaries that shelter us from forces too brilliant and too terrible for our fragile mortal frames to endure. He turned slowly away from the shrouded painting, the lamplight casting long natural shadows across the floorboards as he moved toward his own armchair, his tall, lean frame sinking into the worn cushions with a soft sigh of genuine fatigue. He reached for his violin case, resting beside the chair, his long fingers moving with a practiced, reverent grace as he opened the lid and lifted the beautiful wooden instrument, the polished grain gleaming warmly in the quiet light. As he drew the bow across the strings, the first low, mournful notes filled the room, a melody of profound and tender sadness that seemed to capture the very essence of the mist-shrouded Cornish cliffs and the tragic, undoomed love of Elias Thorne. I closed my eyes, letting the rich, resonant music wash over me, the haunting tune weaving through the scent of rain and tobacco, carrying away the last lingering chills of the cursed, glowing pigment, and replacing them with a gentle, melancholic peace that settled softly over the quiet, shadowed corners of the deep, unending night. The music swelled and fell, a wordless story of love and loss echoing against the walls, wrapping the room in a blanket of sound that was both heartbreakingly sad and infinitely comforting. I felt the tension of the evening fully drain from my shoulders, the strange, ethereal glow of the phosphorescent paint fading from my mind's eye, replaced by the warm, steady reality of the hearth, and the familiar, reassuring presence of my friend lost in his music. The rain outside seemed to match the tempo of his playing, a natural accompaniment to the sorrowful song of the violin, a duet between the weeping sky and the weeping strings that filled the quiet hours before the dawn. As the final, trembling note faded slowly into the silence, hanging in the air like a delicate wisp of smoke, I knew that the shadowless portrait would trouble us no more, its tragic history unravelled, its dangerous light contained, leaving us in the safe, comforting embrace of the ordinary beautiful shadows of our home. We sat in the profound velvet darkness of the great exhibition hall, enveloped by the stillness that only descends upon London when the final heavy carriages have rumbled away into the damp embrace of the midnight fog. The air inside the gallery was heavy with the solemn, quiet scent of aged linseed oil, like a cracking varnish, and the faintly sweet aroma of decaying wooden frames, creating a lingering perfume of forgotten time that settled deep into the lungs with every slow, measured breath. Above us, A grand skylight of frosted glass offered the only meagre illumination, allowing a pallid, milky moonlight to filter down through the shifting night clouds and paint long, distorted shapes across the polished parquet floor. Holmes was a mere silhouette beside me, a motionless shadow seated in a high-backed chair of worn tufted leather, his breathing so incredibly shallow and rhythmically controlled that he might have been one of the painted figures surrounding us, frozen in a perpetual state of silent, breathless observation. I could smell the familiar comforting notes of his strong shag tobacco clinging to the rough tweed of his heavy coat, a subtle, earthy anchor to reality in a room that felt entirely detached from the waking world and the bustling city beyond its thick stone walls. We had been waiting for countless hours, suspended in this quiet, dusty purgatory, listening to the muffled, rhythmic dripping of condensation from the leaded eaves outside, each solitary drop sounding like a tiny glass bell striking against the wet cobblestones in the alleyway. The passage of time in that cavernous room was marked not by the striking of clocks, but by the subtle, creeping journey of the moonlight as it traversed the silent faces of the portraits hanging along the crimson silk walls. These painted lords and ladies, rendered in strokes of brilliant colour now muted by the gloom, seemed to watch us with unblinking, judgmental eyes, their expression shifting as the pale light crept across their oil canvas features. I felt a chill settle into my bones, a damp cold that seeped through my wool trousers and settled in my joints, but I dared not move, dared not disrupt the absolute tranquillity that Holmes had mandated for this midnight vigil. The absolute silence of the gallery was a fragile thing, a delicate glass sphere that the slightest scuff of a boot or clearing of a throat would shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces, warning our elusive quarry of our hidden presence. I closed my eyes for a long moment, allowing my other senses to stretch into the darkness, hearing the faint, distant moan of the wind off the River Thames, carrying with it the briny scent of the tidal water and the sharp tang of coal smoke from the dying fires of the city. When I opened my eyes again, the gallery seemed to have grown even darker, the shadows stretching out like long, reaching fingers from the corners of the room, pooling beneath the gilded frames and obscuring the boundaries between the floor and the walls. It was in this profound, heavy quiet that the first subtle change occurred, a shift so delicate that I might have imagined it had I not felt the sudden, electric tensing of Holmes in the chair beside me. There was no dramatic crash, no forceful opening of a door, but rather a faint whisper, soft exhalation of air, as if the building itself had drawn a breath and slowly let it out through a newly opened fissure. A draught, distinctly colder, and carrying the raw, wet scent of the London fog, curled around my ankles, weaving through the stagnant, varnish-heavy air of the gallery like a ghostly serpent. Accompanying the draught was a sound that barely registered upon the ear, a gentle, continuous brushing, like the sound of dry autumn leaves sliding across a smooth flagstone path, or the trailing of a heavy silk gown across a polished floor. I strained my eyes against the gloom, focusing on the far end of the long hall where the shadows were thickest, where the prized, supposedly cursed portrait of the Duchess of Blackwood hung in its solitary alcove, the very painting we were there to protect. The moonlight did not reach that distant alcove, leaving it cloaked in an impenetrable layer of obsidian darkness, yet I could swear that the darkness itself was moving, subtly shifting and reknitting itself in a way that defied the natural stillness of the room. Holmes leaned forward, a movement so slow and fluid it was entirely silent, his attention locked on the distant alcove with the predatory focus of a nocturnal creature tracing the scent of its prey. The brushing sound ceased, replaced by a soft metallic click, a sound so crisp and tiny it might have been the internal mechanism of a pocket watch engaging its gears, followed by the faint smell of polished brass and a sharp metallic oil. Then the illusion began, a masterful manipulation of the senses that left me questioning the very reliability of my own waking mind as a faint ethereal glow began to emanate from the space directly in front of the Duchess's portrait. It was not the warm, yellow light of a lantern or a match, but a cold, silvery luminescence that perfectly mimicked the moonlight filtering through the skylight above, casting a serene, ghostly pallor over the surrounding crimson walls. What made the breath catch in my throat was not the light itself, but what the light revealed, or rather, what it failed to reveal, for as a dark, cloaked figure stepped into the pool of silver illumination, they cast absolutely no shadow upon the wall behind them. The figure moved with a fluid, mesmerizing grace, their hands reaching out toward the gilded frame of the painting, yet the wall behind them remained a pristine, unbroken stretch of illuminated silk, devoid of the dark silhouette that the laws of nature demanded. I felt a profound sense of disorientation, a gentle vertigo that washed over me as I watched this impossible scene unfold, my mind struggling to reconcile the presence of the solid figure with the glaring absence of their shadow. The thief, for there was no doubt in my mind that we were witnessing the master illusionist at work, seemed to glide rather than walk, their movements slow, deliberate and entirely devoid of any sudden jerks or noises that might break the spell. They wore a long flowing garment of a dark, non-reflective material, a fabric that seemed to drink in the ambient light and refused to give any back, rendering their form as a flat, two-dimensional void moving within the three-dimensional space of the gallery. I watched, thoroughly hypnotized by the quiet beauty of the impossible act, as the thief gently lifted the heavy canvas from its resting place, the painting seeming to float weightlessly in their dark, gloved hands, still without casting a single imperfection upon the illuminated wall. The scent of a strange, powdery chemical reached my nose, a dry, dusty aroma that reminded me of theatrical smoke and crushed chalk, mingling with the pervasive smells of the old gallery and adding a layer of artificiality to the air. It was a performance crafted for an audience of none, a silent ballet of theft executed with a level of artistic precision that demanded a quiet, awestruck reverence, even from those who were sworn to stop it. Beside me, I heard the softest, driest rustle of fabric, and I knew without looking that Holmes was preparing to draw the curtain on this midnight theatrical, to break the beautiful, impossible illusion with the harsh, illuminating light of truth. I caught the faint, sharp scent of sulphur a fraction of a second before the sound registered, the sudden, striking scrape of a match against a rough surface echoing through the silent gallery, like the sharp crack of a dry branch in a quiet forest. The flame flared into existence, a brilliant blossoming flower of warm golden orange light that pushed back the velvet darkness, and threw our own long dramatic shadows leaping wildly against the walls and ceiling of the hall. Holmes held the match steady, using its brief life to ignite the wick of a dark lantern he had kept concealed beneath his coat, turning the shutter to release a concentrated, blinding beam of yellow light directly into the heart of the distant alcove. The sudden, intense illumination sliced through the gloom like a heated blade through wax, striking the cloaked figure and instantly shattering the carefully constructed illusion that had held me entirely captive. In the harsh glare of the lantern, the magic dissolved, replaced by a brilliant, complex arrangement of physical trickery that was, in its own mechanical way, just as breathtaking as the phantom shadowlessness it had produced. The thief froze, the painting still held delicately in their hands, their face obscured by a veil of dark, finely woven mesh that hid their features but could not conceal the sudden, rigid stillness of their posture. The beam of Holmes's lantern revealed the secret of the illusion, illuminating a large, perfectly angled pane of smoked glass positioned between the thief and the wall, a delicate, fragile barrier that reflected a pre-painted backdrop of the crimson wall while allowing the figure to operate behind it. A secondary, highly focused source of light, a cleverly modified and silent dark lantern strapped to the thief's chest was projecting the false moonlight, its beam precisely aligned to pass through the glass without reflection, creating the eerie, shadowless glow. It was a masterpiece of perspective, optics, and painstaking preparation. An intricate trap for the eyes that relied on the perfect darkness of the gallery and the carefully controlled angle of the observer to maintain its flawless deception. I could smell the hot tin and burning oil of the thief's concealed lantern now, a warm mechanical scent that entirely overpowered the faint aroma of theatrical powder, grounding the entire ethereal experience in the firm, tangible world of polished brass and ground glass. A beautiful arrangement of optics, my friend, Holmes whispered, his voice a low, melodious murmur that drifted across the vast, empty space of the gallery, carrying no malice, only the quiet, respectful appreciation of one master craftsman recognizing the meticulous work of another. The The sound of his voice seemed to break the thief's paralysis, and the figure slowly, carefully lowered the heavy portrait back onto its hooks, the canvas settling against the wall with a soft, dull thud that underscored the finality of the moment. There was no attempt to flee, no sudden, desperate dash for the shadows, for the thief clearly understood that the intricate web of light and glass that had been their protection was now a fragile cage, illuminated and exposed by the steady, unyielding beam of Holmes's lantern. The thief reached up with slow, deliberate grace, their dark-gloved hands gently pulling away the mesh veil to reveal a face pale and drawn, faces marked by the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights spent perfecting an impossible craft. It was a face that held no anger, only a quiet, melancholic resignation, the look of a solitary artist whose grandest, most beautiful exhibition had been forced to close upon its very opening night. "You have an exceptional eye for the unseen, Mr. Holmes," the thief replied, their voice barely rising above a whisper, a soft, raspy sigh that blended seamlessly with the ambient settling sounds of the old building and the distant wind. I'd calculated every angle, measured every lumen of the moon's pale light, accounted for the exact curvature of the painted glass, yet I fear I failed to account for the simple, profound stillness of a man who listens to the shadows instead of merely looking at them. I watched as the thief slowly unbuckled the harness of their hidden lantern, the brass fittings clinking softly in the quiet, laying the intricate contraption gently upon the floorboards as a final, physical concession of their defeat. The scent of the dying flame from their extinguished lamp joined the heavy perfume of the gallery, a small smoky testament to the end of the grand illusion, mingling with the old varnish and the damp fog seeping under the distant doors. Holmes stepped forward, his movements slow and unthreatening, the warm circle of his lantern light keeping the thief illuminated, while leaving the rest of the gallery cloaked in its protective velvet darkness, a gentle island of truth in a sea of painted deception. We stood together in that small pool of golden light, an unlikely gathering of three souls in the heart of a sleeping city, surrounded by the silent, watchful portraits that had borne witness to a crime of beautiful, bloodless ingenuity. Holmes spoke quietly with the thief, their voices weaving together in a hushed intellectual discussion of the properties of smoked glass, the refractive index of moonlight, and the delicate art of painting false shadows onto a silk backdrop. It was not a conversation between a detective and a criminal, but a quiet seminar between scholars of the obscure, a sharing of knowledge born of mutual respect for the lengths to which a human mind will go to bend reality to its will. I listened to the gentle cadence of their words, the soft consonants and drawn-out vowels, feeling the profound peace of the gallery settle back over us, an atmosphere of quiet resolution that was more comforting than any triumphant shouting victory. The cold draught from the opened window slowly dissipated, the heavy, varnish-scented air of the room reclaiming its territory, wrapping us in its familiar historical embrace as the final notes of the illusion faded into memory. When the quiet officials of the law finally arrived, summoned by a prearranged signal Holmes had left with a trusted street watcher, they entered the gallery with heavy, echoing boots that rudely shattered the delicate acoustic peace we had shared. The harsh glare of their bullseye lanterns swept across the room, harsh and unforgiving, completely lacking the measured, appreciative warmth of Holmes's singular beam, transforming the magical, shadowy space back into an ordinary room of dust, wood, and paint. The thief was led away, their dark garments losing their mystical void-like quality in the bright, overlapping lights, becoming nothing more than ordinary high-quality black silk, smelling faintly of the city streets and damp fog. We watched them go, standing side by side in the doorway of the gallery, breathing in the cold, wet air of the London night, feeling the sharp contrast between the damp chill of the fog and the heavy, preserved warmth of the museum behind us. Holmes closed the heavy oak doors with a firm, solid thud, the sound echoing down the deserted street, a final, definitive period at the end of a long, quietly beautiful sentence. Our journey back to the familiar comforts of Baker Street was undertaken in a gentle, companionable silence, the cab moving slowly through the thick, yellow fog that had rolled in off the river to blanket the sleeping city in a soft, muffling embrace. The rhythmic, steady clatter of the horses' hooves against the wet cobblestones provided a soothing, hypnotic metronome, lulling my weary mind into a state of peaceful reflection, as we rolled through the hazy, gaslit streets of London. Inside the cab, the air smelled of damp wool, old leather, and the lingering smoky remnants of Holmes's tobacco, a comforting bouquet that promised the imminent return to the warmth and safety of our own hearth and home. I watched the fuzzy, glowing halos of the street lamps pass by our window, each one a miniature sun struggling to pierce the gloom, casting brief, fleeting shadows across Holmes's thoughtful face, before plunging us back into the comforting darkness of the carriage. He sat with his eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, entirely lost in the quiet processing of the night's elegant puzzle, leaving me to my own quiet musings on the nature of light, perception, and the shadows we choose not to see. When we finally climbed the 17 steps to our rooms, the flat was cold and silent, the air carrying the familiar, slightly dusty scent of old paper, chemical reagents, and the faint, sweet trace of Mrs. Hudson's lavender floor polish. I went immediately to the fireplace, kneeling on the rug to coax the sleeping embers back to life, the soft scrape of the poker and the dry crinkle of kindling creating a comforting domestic symphony in the quiet room. As the first small flames took hold, feeding on the dry wood and sending a curl of fragrant, woodsy smoke up the chimney, a gentle warmth began to radiate outward, slowly pushing back the damp chill that had settled deep into my bones during our long vigil. Holmes removed his heavy overcoat with a slow, weary grace, draping it over the back of a chair before sinking down into his own familiar velvet armchair, pulling his pipe from the mantel and filling it with the dark, aromatic shag tobacco from his Persian slipper. The striking of his match was a quiet, intimate echo of the grand illumination in the gallery, the brief flare lighting his sharp features before settling down into the steady, red glow of the burning bowl, sending sweet, heavy clouds of smoke rising toward the ceiling. The firelight danced across the walls of our sitting room, casting long, familiar shadows that flickered and swayed with the gentle draughts of the old house. They were shadows that belonged entirely to us, solid, honest, and securely attached to the objects that cast them. I sat opposite him, holding a steaming cup of tea that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully left on the warming tray, the heat of the porcelain seeping into my cold hands, the rising steam carrying the delicate, grassy aroma of Darjeeling that soothed my throat. The only sounds in the room were the comforting, irregular crackle and pop of the burning logs, the soft, rhythmic puffing of Holmes's pipe, and the distant, muffled ticking of the mantel clock marking the slow, steady passage of the early morning hours. We sat in that perfect domestic tranquillity for a long time, allowing the warmth of the fire and the comforting familiarity of our surroundings to wash away the lingering, surreal residue of the shadowless illusion we had witnessed. It was a piece born of a mystery gently solved, a quiet corner of the night where the mind could rest, letting the memory of the gallery fade into the soft grey edges of a sleep that was soon to come. "Illusion is a curious thing, Watson," Holmes finally murmured, his voice a low, resonant purr that blended perfectly with the crackling of the fire, drifting across the space between us like a physical manifestation of the smoke he exhaled. "It requires a profound understanding of human nature, a mastery of expectation to convince a man that what he knows to be true is false, and what he knows to be impossible is standing right before his eyes in the pale moonlight." He reached out with the poker, gently shifting a log in the grate, sending a shower of bright golden sparks spiralling up into the dark throat of the chimney, briefly illuminating the soot-stained bricks with a flurry of brief dying stars. The thief tonight was not merely stealing canvas and oil, he was attempting to steal our very perception of reality, to master the light so completely that the darkness itself became his obedient servant, an artistic endeavour that almost demands a quiet round of applause. The firelight caught the reflection in his eyes, two tiny, dancing flames that spoke of a deep, abiding contentment, the quiet satisfaction of a mind that had unravelled the beautiful, tangled threads of a masterful deception and restored the natural order of the shadows. I took a slow, warming sip of my tea, feeling the fragrant liquid chase the last remnants of the damp gallery chill from my chest, surrounded by the comforting smells of old books, pipe smoke, and burning oak. I thought of the heavy, silent portraits hanging in the velvet darkness across the city, their unblinking eyes watching over an empty hall, their secrets safe once more beneath the frosted glass of the skylight and the drifting, pale moonlight. The night had been a journey into a world where the impossible had briefly stepped into the light, where shadows had been unmoored from their worldly anchors. But here, in the quiet, firelit warmth of Baker Street, the laws of nature remained comforting and secure. We would speak no more of it tonight, letting the silence settle over us once again, a heavy, peaceful blanket that wrapped us in the simple, enduring fellowship of two men watching the embers glow, listening to the gentle, unceasing whisper of the London rain beginning to fall against the window panes. The grand doors of the gallery close with a soft and resonant thud, leaving the long corridors to their profound and rightful silence. Within those halls the shadows have untangled themselves from the chaos of the night, stretching out obediently beneath the canvases and returning to the quiet order of things. Outside, the cool breath of the early morning greets Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, wrapping around their heavy woolen coats as a solitary hansom cab carries them through the slumbering streets of London. The rhythmic clatter of horse hooves against damp cobblestones sounds like a steady heartbeat echoing through the waking city, accompanied by the faint earthy scent of river mist mingled with the distant smoke of morning fires. The pale, pearlescent grey of dawn begins to gently bleed over the rooftops, chasing away the last lingering phantoms of the dark. Soon, they are stepping over the familiar threshold of Baker Street, enveloped immediately by the deeply comforting sense of stale pipe tobacco, worn leather, and the sweet promise of hot tea. The sitting room is peacefully dim, illuminated only by the soft orange glow of the dying embers in the hearth. They settle into their armchairs, allowing the quiet resolution of the case to wash over them in the stillness of the room. The firelight flickers and fades, carrying away the burdens of the waking world. Let the gentle warmth of this sanctuary bring you peace. Close your eyes, let go of the day, and may a deep, restful sleep take you. Good night.